Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture on early medieval Europe for my course, World Civilization to 1500. When last we had spoken about Rome, and in particular the later Roman Empire, we said that Rome at its end begins to dissolve, especially in Western Europe. And in particular, we will see later on that the eastern part of the empire will in essence continue to live on. And in some sense, as Rome begins to lose control of its territory, it begins to strategically aim after protecting some of those eastern areas, the eastern provinces, which in many cases were far richer than the western ones. But this also meant that it would leave Western Europe and the portions that used to belong to the Roman Empire to its own devices. And in particular, is what we discussed is that in what today is modern-day Germany, barbarian groups will really begin to come down from the northern parts, from what today is modern-day Germany, often in small, fragmented series of groups, and they begin to attack and take over land in Western Europe. So this is going to, as a whole, usher into an era of a much more fragmented political era than previous. So whereas we previously had one unified Roman Empire, what we're going to see instead is a series of smaller kingdoms, new kingdoms, sometimes referred to as barbarian kingdoms, sometimes referred to as sub-Roman kingdoms. And these different barbarian tribes will end up taking every area of the former Roman Empire in Western Europe. And really, in some sense, really they begin as a whole to collectively shift the politics of Western Europe up to the north, away to the previous focus, which had been on the Mediterranean to the south. And here in this map, you can just see some of the various groups that begin to take over these areas. These new kingdoms, these new barbarian kingdoms, will have new rulers. They will displace the Roman emperor, but they will continue to use the authority and the institutions of the empire. So, for instance, they will borrow from Roman law, sometimes ideas about Roman bureaucracy. Sometimes they will set up shop in the same exact buildings that previously had been used under the Roman Empire while it was still functional. Yet we do think that, and in some cases too, you can see that they will actually even borrow the same kind of coinage that was once used under Rome is used now with barbarian rulers. This is a Spanish ruler. A Visigothic ruler. Here is just some of the ornamentation in some cases, which borrows from Roman exemplars. Yet this is really a different world that we're facing now in Western Europe once the Roman Empire is no more. One of the things that would have struck you the most would have been that the huge Roman army would disappear at this point. That is not to say that armies disappear or warfare, far from it, but there is a really a much different attitude now. The attitude becomes that a barbarian king should be able to call upon his own warriors, his own men to go to battle for him. But this was not a regular professional salaried position. You fought when your leader told you to fight. We really think that in most cases, these warriors had to provide for their own armor and their own food while fighting. But we really also see connected with this, the disappearance of the Roman army was taxation. The normal sort of mechanisms of taxation in Western Europe begin to disappear. And bear in mind, the vast majority of taxes in the Roman Empire would always flow to the army, but without having a regular salaried army, it really was no longer necessary. Some of the other things that would come along with having taxation also begin to die out as well. Some of the things that Romans were known for. So, for instance, the great public works projects that we had discussed, things like aqueducts, can no longer be maintained out of the central money that was collected from taxation. Things like bridges and roads. These also no longer have public funding. And you'll see private initiative sometimes to fix up these things, but that is a far cry from having the money of a huge centralized state or the army to be able to fix these things. And on the whole, what this means is that what we begin to see throughout Western Europe is much more aggressively small-scale and local cultures. Trade begins to fall off, and on the whole, we think they're lesser physical condition. Another of the big changes, and this is the one that we'll discuss in greater detail now, as you can see from the sarcophagus, is that there also is a much more widespread conversion to Christianity. It becomes the religion of the majority of subjects in Western Europe in these new sub-barbarian kingdoms, sub-Roman kingdoms. We don't have time in a course like this to speak about all of these new kingdoms that begin to emerge at this time in Western Europe. So we'll really only just focus on the kingdom of the barbarian people known as the Franks, who really were the only one whose kingdom really expands to the point in which it becomes a large empire. The king among the Franks, who is sometimes known as the one who really helps to cement their authority in modern-day France, which of course comes from the term Frank, is this man pictured here, Clovis. This is a much later image of Clovis. And Clovis would lead the Franks on a series of campaigns that would really wipe out Roman authority, Roman control over France. And he will begin to impose authority on all sorts of different barbarian groups who lived in France. And he also begins the process now of beginning to build a new state. One of the things, though, that's very interesting to us about Clovis is that certainly a lot of his success was built upon his military might and his ability to fight. We think, though, that this was not enough to be able to cement his long-scale success. And what he begins to recognize is that he is actually, if he's going to be successful, he has to find some way to get closer to the majority of the population who had Roman background. And Clovis's success ultimately is predicated upon his religious choice. And you can see here, this is a much later painting that shows the culmination of this decision for him to convert to Orthodox Christianity. The Christianity of the Pope, the Christianity that was represented by the majority of the subjects who had Roman background in France. This is a very, very famous scene here. He's being baptized by the Bishop Remigius, who supposedly said, you will burn what you have loved, and you will love what you have burned. As previously, Clovis had been really no friend to Christianity or the church. Now, what's important about this is that at the time where Clovis decides to convert to Orthodox Christianity, most people who came from a barbarian background were Christian, but they were the wrong kind of Christian. They were viewed as heretical Christians by the mainstream church. Clovis recognized if he was ever to gain the allegiance of many of his subjects, it would be better then for him to convert to Orthodox Christianity. once he did this, he was able to gain support from the Pope and from bishops. And it really allowed some of his subjects who otherwise would have had hesitation about following someone who had a barbarian background to really be in his camp from this point on. I should say, too, that one of the reasons why the Franks ended up becoming as important as they did in France was that they begin to venerate some of the very popular saints and be generous to the church. And to just provide one famous example, this is Martin of Tours. Martin of Tours was actually known as a late Roman soldier who would end up converting to Christianity. And he's shown here in this scene in one of his most famous stories told about him. He saw a shivering beggar, and he ended up slicing his cloak into two and giving half of it to the beggar. And later on, in a dream vision, he discovered that beggar had actually been Jesus Christ. And this is one of the saints, especially the Frankish royal family, would patronize highly. We think the Franks would actually become even stronger under the new dynasty that it was known as the Carolingians. And this was really, this new dynasty ends up being essentially being founded by the person shown in this picture, the great war leader known as Charles Martel, a name that means Charles the Hammer. And we think that Charles Martel was actually himself never a king, but he was known to be one of the most successful war leaders in later generations among the Franks. And really gained him a lot of notoriety in his own day, or just glory, one might even say, is his defeat of an invading Muslim army in southern France near Tours. And in fact, this may have really discouraged a much wider scale invasion of Muslims into France. And it certainly gave Charles Martel a great deal of charisma, both for him personally and then for the members of his family. And so then not Charles Martel, but then it was his grandson, known as Charlemagne, who was then able in essence to use that charisma and convert it, then to be able to become both a king and then later on in his career become an emperor. And one of the primary reasons why we're interested in Charlemagne is that he was able to reestablish a centralized imperial rule in a society that had not had it for a long time. And really, in essence, to begin to strip a lot of power, local power, away from smaller rulers and then bring it to himself. And as you can see here, as he did so, Charlemagne seemed to view himself and portray himself in images like this coin as a Roman emperor. He was bringing back an empire of some way. Charlemagne, we know too, was extremely intelligent. He spoke Latin. He supposedly conversed with theologians and learned men. We know that he used some of the money that he gained from this new empire to sponsor his interest in art, all sorts of classical works from the Roman world, church fathers like Augustine, and to gather all sorts of scholars at his court to be able to do their learning. We also know that he built a chapel in honor of the Virgin Mary, which supposedly drew upon Eastern styles to be able to do so. We know, too, that Charlemagne was able to maintain diplomatic relationships with surrounding empires, including, among those we've studied, the Abbasid Caliphate. And he actually ends up getting an elephant as a diplomatic present from the Abbasid Caliph. All of this, and really, all of this fighting would eventually culminate in the decision of the Pope to crown Charlemagne as emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. And this was something that we think worked for both the Pope and for the emperor, the newly crowned emperor, because we would think that Charlemagne wanted to have a religious sanction for his rule, and we think that the Pope was, especially in these unsettled times politically, needed to have a powerful secular authority under really helping him out, protecting him. We think that the empire that the Franks would found, and that Charlemagne was so systematic in maintaining, would really begin to unravel even as soon as the next generation. We think that Charlemagne's son, in essence, was really in some ways unwilling or unable to do the constant kind of military campaigning that made Charlemagne such an important ruler. And that was really a significant lapse, because we think that really rulership under Charlemagne, he was able to maintain his power as well as he did because he would constantly go on battle, he would plunder places, and he would distribute the money to his followers. If the problems already begin to creep in then under his son, under Charlemagne's grandsons, the problem would become even worse, with all of them battling among themselves in a civil war to decide who would get the pieces of the large empire that had once belonged to one man, to Charlemagne. And as if this situation wasn't bad enough, we think that while some of the great men of the Franks were fighting for who would get various parts of this kingdom, we see that taking advantage of this time of political uncertainty, we see Western Europe begins to experience a new series of invasions from virtually every side, which will even further to destabilize a region that is having problems. So, for instance, you can see on this map that one of the series of invaders came from the south, so Muslim invasions hit areas, especially in southern Italy, although they made it as far as the city of Rome and actually would sack St. Peter's. We see, too, that there was a group who would come from the east, who are known as the Magyars, who in essence are the ancestors of modern-day Hungarians. And we think that they had faced pressure from other groups, and their original civilization in Central Asia begins to crumble, which leads them then to attack what is modern-day Germany. The most famous series of invasions, however, would come from the north, from the areas that we know as Scandinavia today, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These are a group that were referred to as the Vikings. And we think that as a lead-up to their period of invasion in Western Europe, Vikings had been experiencing significant population pressure in their home countries. There were too many people for too few resources. And really, certainly not enough that everyone could do agriculture. We also think, too, that the Vikings were experiencing something of a technology boom in the production of ships. And here's just one of the many fine ships that were produced by the Vikings. And what's very interesting about their ships is, first of all, they're very sturdy. They can actually go onto the high seas with little problem or little danger of breaking apart. And the other thing that's actually that's unique about these ships is that they have very flat bottoms, which allows them to go to even to relatively small rivers. And in fact, they could very quickly sort of navigate into a small river that didn't have a deep bottom. They could find a settlement that looked like it was good for plunder, and then they would steal things very quickly, and then they would get right back on their ship and they would get out again. And we think that the combination of having people who wanted to make a name and earn money and having very good ship technology meant that all of a sudden the Vikings begin to unleash this series of devastating attacks throughout Western Europe. Here's just some of the various sort of long swords that were used by some of these Vikings in these attacks. And we think that these attacks were particularly dangerous because we think that when these Vikings begin to attack, they really show absolutely no respect for some of the religious sites, like, for instance, churches and monasteries, because they were pagan, and they didn't necessarily worry about the possible sacrilege of attacking Christian sites. The initial attacks in Western Europe, we think, were simply these Vikings attacking quickly and then leaving ever so quickly. But in time, we think that some of these Vikings begin to actually winter over and, in fact, begin to just directly take over the territories. Like, for instance, just one famous example is this territory here in modern-day France, known as Normandy. That was, in essence, becomes a Viking territory within Western Europe that is controlled directly by them. I should also say, too, that it is a little bit unfair to Vikings to just think about them as conquerors or as destroyers. And really, they use some of the same exact technology, too, to go on what really is a series of far more peaceful explorations and sometimes colonizations of territories that other Western Europeans did not appear to really be as interested in exploring. And so you can see here from this map that we actually will see Vikings go and settle partially in Iceland, Greenland, and in fact we do know that there were a certain number of Vikings who actually make it as far as Canada. And we've actually discovered some of the remains of the short settled areas in Canada. Some of the foundries, for instance, they created there. We tend to think that most of the natives that they ran into in the Americas were fairly hostile to the Vikings, and that may have been the reason why they did not choose to live there for a long period of time. The combination of both the civil war of the Franks and these various invasions really ends up destroying any sort of large-scale government. And so some people think that government in Western Europe really begins to get reduced down to a local level. And instead we see Europe becoming a society of really small competing regional states. And it really, in some sense, it was even difficult to figure out during this period of relative confusion who was in charge. I mean, when some of the people of their own time tried to figure out who were the major groups in society, they would say that there were three. There were the people who prayed, so priests and monks, the people who fought, meaning, of course, nobles who were notified, and there were people who worked, that is, the peasants, the vast majority of the population who worked on the land. The system that arises then in the rubble of civil wars and invasions is sometimes referred to as feudal society, and inasmuch as it was a system, some people would describe the political system that would come out as feudalism. Now, you probably got the idea that I'm a little skeptical to what degree this was a very clear system at all, because it was not well ordered or similar everywhere. If there is something that really appears to us about this system that's unique, it is that many of these figures, like emperors or kings who previously could depend upon a wide degree of allegiance among people in their realms, found that they were actually far less powerful than before. Power becomes more and more fragmented. Really, because the kings and emperors are unable then to control large swaths of territory, what you end up seeing instead is that all of these small nobles begin to, like this fellow, to suit themselves up, and they begin to go around and take over territory and rule it in their own names. And in some cases are really not really paying respect to any broader authority. They become the major authority in their own territories by means of military violence. Sometimes we have these images of knights in shining armor from the Middle Ages, but knights would sometimes run around, essentially beating up on peasants and forcing them to recognize them as their lords and the people who had authority over them. So perhaps a slightly less heroic image than we have in our minds. These lords would in many cases be the ones to collect rents themselves, administer local affairs, mobilize their own armed forces as they see fit, and decide legal cases in their own territory that had belonged to them, that they conquered. Far more important in this system of feudalism than anything like a big government, what we see instead really becomes very important are person-to-person contacts. This was normally affected by ritual means. People would have to swear an oath of loyalty. The higher person in this relationship was known as a lord, and the person who would swear loyalty to them was known as a vassal. And this would normally involve the vassal getting down on his knees and cupping his hands together as if in prayer, and the higher person, the lord in this relationship, would take his hands take the hands of the lower person into his hands, and they would seal it with a ritual kiss. This was not a romantic kiss. This was a kiss that is meant to symbolize this newfound unity and closeness between the two people. The higher person in this relationship theoretically was supposed to aid the lower person, sometimes known as the vassal, give them military aid. But the lower person in the relationship then was supposed to help their lord when they needed it. We really see then everyone begins to enter into these kinds of person-to-person relationships mediated by ritual. The only question was what you could provide in these new relationships. So peasants, for instance, could give tax money from their agriculture. They could provide services on the lands owned by their lords. Lesser nobles could fight for greater nobles in battle. This really also ends up applying, we really think about these kind of services as being, these agricultural services as being, really important for this system to operate. We really see, in essence, too, in essence, the agricultural side, that many members of the church, for instance, were also entering into these new kinds of relationships, except that instead of providing, for instance, fighting for their lords, they could, for instance, provide prayers for them. So they too would enter into these relationships, and you really had very little choice except to enter into personal relationships with greater nobles if you wanted to just basically gain protection against others. The economy on the whole, we think, overwhelmingly becomes rural. Across early medieval Europe, there tend to be very few cities and towns. Many of those from the ancient world had contracted, and some places had gone under entirely. And we really see altogether that really it's a small-scale trading system. Many cases, areas become somewhat self-sufficient. And some of the few active traders in these time periods were the Vikings, although it is very unclear to us to what degree in their minds there was a difference between trading and raiding. We think that when they had the operational capacity to do so, they preferred raiding, but they would also trade at times too. Now, as I had hinted to you earlier, and as you can see here in this beautifully illustrated prayer book from the early Middle Ages, what you would have experienced as one of the most significant cultural developments in Western Europe was the wide-scale conversion of people to Roman Catholicism. And we really see in the church all kinds of inherited cultural elements from classical Roman society. And some of you know, for instance, that within, for instance, both the intellectual writings of the church and also in the worship and the liturgy, they would continue to use the Latin language. And in fact, the Latin language was used within the Roman Catholic Church until the 20th century. So this really had a very long life ahead of it. And we really think that we said perhaps the greatest example then is this alliance between secular rulers and the church comes in the form of the Franks, but this same sort of alliance between secular rulers and the church becomes fairly common. And we really see, in essence, that in many cases in the early Middle Ages, some of the few people who had access to education, who were literate, were people who were within the church. And this was at least part of the reason why secular rulers were often interested in giving them money to be able then to develop their mission. Even more important, though, than just keeping the books was the idea that that both priests and monks were helping to be able to preserve people's status as being holy in God's eyes, and that ultimately they were helping to lead people towards salvation, which was perhaps even more important ultimately than this world. Part of Charlemagne's goal, as I mentioned to you earlier, in all of his conquests in Western Europe, was to create new territory for Christianity to thrive. So, for instance, the northern Germanic people known as the Saxons, not only did he go on a long, bitter war to defeat them militarily, but one of the conditions of their peace settlement was that these people would have to convert to Christianity. And we can see this is kind of a much more muscular form of conversion than some of the peaceful conversion that the church had known previously. And really, we think that in time, it's part of just coming into Western Europe, the Western European cultural sphere, meant accepting Christianity. And although it would take a long time, even the Vikings, who, as we said, initially start off as a group of hardcore pagans, they would also begin to embrace Christianity and convert. Now, there's many different facets of the Christianity of Western Europe in this time we could discuss. Here I want to just discuss two that are particularly important, I think. First of all, the growth in papal authority, and second of all, the development of monasticism. Now, first, when we talk about the Pope, many of you may claim, with some justification, that, of course, the papacy is not something new in the early Middle Ages in Europe. It had existed now for centuries. And the reasons for the Pope's authority were many. There, of course, is a scriptural basis to the papacy gaining power. The verse about Jesus giving the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter, who's seen as the first pope. And we also will see that Rome in particular was seen as a very holy city, in part because it had gained the reputation of being very good about martyring some of the early saints. And so that meant that there were a lot of relics or the bodies or remains of saints still in the city of Rome. Above all, the saints Peter and Paul. So it really meant that Rome was a very holy place, and some of the churches built over these dead bodies were seen to be particularly important. On top of this, and in particular during the early Middle Ages, we begin to see some particularly talented men take on the position of Pope. And in the 5th century, one that comes to mind in particular is this man pictured in a much later statue here, Leo I. And we really see that Leo himself had a good background in Roman law, and he comes up with a very clear and systematic account of why popes ought to have their authority that was based upon a legal argument, saying, for instance, that just as a father can leave things to a son to inherit, so too did Peter then give off things that later popes could inherit. So Peter is the first pope and kind of a father in this picture. What's shown here, and again, this is a much later image of this famous story, is when Pope Leo actually will go out and negotiate with one of the many groups who were attacking Western Europe at the time, the Huns, and ask them not to attack Rome. And at least this was, as you can see here, the story always talks about Peter and Paul sort of floating overhead as protectors as he did this. Although in part 2, we know that Leo does bribe the Huns not to attack as well. It's one of the reasons why they chose not to. And some people also think the Huns might have been experiencing at least some disease in their camp, one of the reasons why they chose not to. One of the things that's interesting about Leo, though, is, again, he wears many different hats. And so in addition to doing these kind of these public things, we also see that he is a theologian. And he really creates this very clear exposition for how it is that Jesus can be both human and divine simultaneously, something that was really dividing a lot of people at the time. And we see Leo then really, in some sense, overtaking this role that later popes would develop, that popes had very little desire to argue over traditional beliefs of Christianity. They found really a lot of the theological debates as philosophical hair-spinning. And the idea was that that the popes would stay true to the statement of beliefs that had already been in existence for a long time. And you could go to the pope to be able to get a very conservative viewpoint theologically. Unlike, as we'll see later on with Byzantine bishops, the Pope in Western Europe is going to have an independent power base, and he really was able to take his own theological line apart from political rulers. And it's to some degree then he's actually going to become both a rallying point and an advisor to other Western bishops. Another of the very important popes is pictured here in an ivory carving. This is Gregory the Great, and you can see Gregory is actually has the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, who's actually sitting on his shoulder here and dictating to him, it looks like. You can see in the background too, these are meant to be the city walls of the city of Rome. Gregory also has to defend Rome against some of the barbarians who lived in northern Italy and who threatened to attack it. So he also is someone who has to think a great deal about defense of the city of Rome. We also see, though, in some ways, Gregory had to assume some of the acts that used to be overtaken by the Roman state, that once the Roman state crumbles can no longer be done by it. So one of the things, for instance, that Roman emperors would do in the past was that they would distribute free grain to the urban poor. And Gregory recognizes that they're no longer there to do that, so it is now him and the church who will begin to overtake those positions and give out food to the poor. Now, you're seeing here, by the way, this is Gregory saying Mass, and we do think that Gregory does certainly create some prayers of his own, but in later generations, he'll be attributed the entire style of chant that is this sort of plain chant that is associated with the church, the Gregorian chant, which, although it receives his name, is really not his creation in particular. Gregory does, though, certainly spend a good deal of time also setting down theological works. In part, this has to do with how to be a good priest. He writes a standard handbook that people read about how to be a good priest. He writes about this entire miracle collection about saints who are performing good deeds in Italy to serve as a model for people of his own time. He will write a biblical commentary about, for instance, the book of Job and the questions it presents about suffering. Gregory will also send out letters that will go throughout Western Europe. Really, again, this constant sort of stream of letters the popes will send out to advise bishops, priests, the laity, will also really begin to ratchet up the stature of the papacy and make it the center of authority. On top of all these other things, we see Gregory really very carefully administering land and using some of the land of the church then to be able to fund things like hospitals and churches. Perhaps what ended up actually being one of the most successful of the missions that Gregory would undertake was one that actually takes place outside of Rome. Gregory, upon seeing the end of the Roman world, was severely convinced that the end of the world was coming, and really in quite a literal sense. And when he was called to judgment, he would be judged much more harshly than other people because he was in a position of authority. And so at least one way he could stave off a harsh judgment from God was he could try to convert as many people as possible to Christianity. And so we see Gregory supporting a new missionary effort to go to England, which at the time was basically the end of the world for people who lived in the city of Rome. And these new missions that he sent out were wildly successful. And it really, and some of the people who convert in England, some of the people there will also themselves decide to go on mission. And so, for instance, people will from England will go to Ireland, some will go to northern Germany. And so altogether, this is going to lead to a much broader series of conversions of people in the northern parts of Europe. And the important part about these conversions is the people in these new areas are going to be well aware that they had never actually received visits from the apostles. In fact, the person who had brought them into the faith was Gregory, and more broadly, the Pope. And so this is going to lead to this very high estimation by the papacy by people in Northern Europe. And this is why, in many cases, these new converts are going to go out of their way to seek papal position. What exactly is the correct theological position on something? What is the ideal way to worship God? And so they're going to, because of this esteem, they're going to go out of their way to try to find out what the papacy has to say about various things. I should say, too, that it really is not just the popes who have this new position of control throughout Western Europe, and that in many cases, especially as Roman authority crumbles, it is often local bishops and sometimes abbots who will become some of the most powerful men in various local spots throughout Western Europe. The other important movement in the Christianity of this time is monasticism. Now, we've spoken earlier about there is always a trend within Christianity for certain people to want to go off and live as hermits by themselves, to lead a harsh lifestyle with spiritual aims. And what we'll see too increasingly is that many of these people will want to live together, and we'll see before this point in Western Europe, there really is this constellation of different communities, people seeking to live holy lives, all of whom will develop their own rules and procedures. And in fact, some of these will demand an extremely austere lifestyle, so difficult that in some cases some people end up dropping out. It is into this picture that the person on the left here, known as Benedict of Nursia, will step into the picture. And he will create a series of regulations, or what is known as a rule, for the monastery of Monte Cassino, that is near Rome. And we really think what's the sort of genius of Benedict's rule is that it was not extreme monasticism. Here's, for instance, is a monk drinking some wine, and that was, of course, perfectly allowable under Benedict's rule. What the rule of Benedict allowed was that monks had to take vows to live together, live lives in a community, live lives of celibacy, live lives under the absolute direction of their abbot. And here's just another later image of Benedict. Among the prime virtues that monks had to undertake were poverty, chastity, and obedience. And they have to spend all sorts of time in prayer, in meditation, and doing work. They really believe that idleness is the devil's playhouse, so you had to keep working. This is what Monte Cassino, the first monastery that was founded by Benedict, looks like today. It has been heavily rebuilt, though. We're going to see that monks under the rule of Benedict will give certain hours for religious services and prayer, and then times for study, reflection, and then manual labor. We also think that Benedict was assisted by the influence of his sister, Saint Scholastica, who may have given some idea of how women may be able to use the rule, although the rule was in particular designed for men. At least initially. Monasteries like that Saint Benedict would create under his rule would become the dominant feature in the social and cultural life of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. We know that because of this belief that the prayers of monks, people who lived their entire lives for God, their prayers were better than ordinary people's prayers. They really they do accumulate very large land holdings. People will very often give land to monks for their for saying prayers for their souls, saying masses for the souls of dead people. And so, although on an individual level monks are poor, on the whole, in fact, the order of the Benedictines will become very rich. And we think that in addition to just simply ordering the countryside and really helping to direct agriculture, we think that monks begin, for instance, to create inns for travelers, for people, for instance, going on pilgrimage will stay with them. In some cases, they'll give medical treatment. In other cases, they will have schools for rudimentary education for at least some people. The monasteries, too, are very important for our job as historians. Monasteries would maintain libraries. And in fact, almost all works of Latin Roman literature will be copied and preserved in monasteries. So they're very important for the perpetuation of knowledge in Western Europe in this period. Many of these manuscripts are beautifully illuminated by monks. This is just one example known as the Book of Kells, an Irish manuscript, which very interestingly will combine the Latin works of the Gospels, but then will use this native Irish style to illuminate them. So the two of them, in fact, will come together in this manuscript. This is, for instance, Jesus being tempted on top of the temple. So in many ways, in fact, you cannot simply dismiss this period of Western European history as a dark age. There certainly was a lot of culture going on. You just have to know where to look for it. Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.